In global finance, power rarely announces itself. It moves quietly, through contracts, clauses, and signatures that seem insignificant until years later, when entire nations feel the weight of a single decision. This is one of those stories. A deal struck behind closed doors. A mine buried beneath African soil. And a ripple that reshaped wealth, politics, and influence far beyond its borders. At first it looked like progress. Jobs promised. Infrastructure pledged. Revenues projected into the billions. On paper, it was a standard mining agreement, one of hundreds signed across the continent in the early 21st century. But beneath the numbers, something didn't add up. The ownership structure was unusual. The timelines were rushed. And the beneficiaries were strangely distant from the communities whose land was being transformed. As years passed, investors began asking quiet questions. Journalists noticed patterns repeating across borders. Governments recalculated what they thought they owned. For ordinary citizens, the realization came later, when promised prosperity never arrived and political power seemed to drift further out of reach. What happens when a single financial agreement doesn't just extract resources, but rewires influence itself? Could something like this happen in your country? If stories like this fascinate you, subscribe and join us as we uncover the hidden mechanics of global finance. And tell us in the comments, what country are you watching from? The deal began without drama. No emergency summits. No flashing headlines. Just a delegation of government officials, a handful of foreign executives, and a document thick with legal language that few outside the room would ever read. To the countries signing it, the agreement represented opportunity, foreign capital flowing into an underdeveloped mining sector, transforming dormant land into national revenue. Early economic indicators seemed reassuring. Commodity prices were climbing. Global demand for rare minerals was accelerating, driven by infrastructure booms and emerging technologies. Analysts at international banks described Africa as the next frontier, a phrase that sounded optimistic but carried an unspoken urgency. Whoever secured access first would shape supply chains for decades. But buried deep in the contract was an unfamiliar structure. Ownership wasn't direct. Profits moved through layered subsidiaries registered thousands of miles away. Royalties were fixed at levels that looked reasonable, until commodity prices doubled. For government accountants, the spreadsheet still balanced. For investors watching closely, something felt unusually asymmetric. Local citizens noticed changes first on the ground. Roads appeared near the mine but not beyond it. Security tightened. Access narrowed. Promised schools and clinics remained drawings on presentation slides. Journalists attempting to trace the deal's backers ran into silence. Corporate spokespeople citing confidentiality, ministries redirecting questions. In foreign markets, the company behind the deal attracted quiet enthusiasm. Its valuation climbed steadily, untethered from production numbers. Traders whispered that the real value wasn't the mine itself, but the control embedded in the agreement. A long-term lock on strategic minerals, secured at a moment when oversight was weakest. Still, no alarms sounded. Governments elsewhere signed similar deals. Analysts labeled concerns premature. The contract, after all, was legal. What almost no one realized at the time was this. The agreement didn't just define extraction. It redefined who would hold leverage when the world finally needed what lay beneath that soil. The first warning signs didn't come from politicians or investors. They came from auditors. Years into production, revenue figures failed to match export volumes. Shipments left ports at full capacity, yet national accounts reflected only modest gains. On paper, everything followed the contract. In reality, value was slipping through channels few regulators could see. Government officials began requesting revisions. Minor adjustments, they said, to reflect changing market conditions. The responses were polite but firm. The contract was binding. Arbitration clauses pointed not to local courts, but to international panels and distant financial capitals. Legal teams reviewed the fine print and went quiet. Challenging the deal would cost more than the country could afford. Inside the corporation's headquarters, confidence hardened into certainty. Earnings calls emphasized stability. Executives spoke of long-term strategic positioning, a phrase analysts recognized as code for something deeper. Share prices rose not because of output, but because of permanence. The deal had locked in predictability, something markets value more than fairness. Ordinary citizens felt the disconnect more sharply. Inflation crept upward. Public budgets tightened. People asked how a mine producing billions could coexist with underfunded hospitals. Economists on local radio programs struggled to explain capital flows that never touched domestic banks. The wealth existed, but it didn't circulate. Foreign journalists began connecting dots. Similar agreements appeared across borders, signed during moments of political transition or fiscal stress. Each followed the same pattern: short-term relief, long-term dependency. Economists exchanged glances, a mix of recognition and dread. Then came the quiet shift. A policy memo leaked. It suggested the government no longer controlled its most valuable asset in any meaningful way. Not legally. Not financially. Not politically. The contract that once promised development had become something else entirely, a mechanism of influence that could not be easily undone. And that was the moment global markets started paying attention. The realization didn't arrive as a crash. It arrived as a recalculation. In trading rooms across London, New York, and Hong Kong, analysts began revising long-term models. Not because production had stalled, but because control had concentrated. A single mining deal was now shaping supply forecasts across multiple industries, from construction to clean energy. And the leverage sat far from the ground where the minerals were pulled. Foreign governments took notice next. Diplomatic cables grew cautious in tone. Resource security briefings began referencing the deal indirectly, describing non-state concentration risks. What had once looked like a commercial agreement now appeared in geopolitical analyses. The mine wasn't just feeding markets, it was anchoring influence. Inside the country, political pressure intensified. Opposition leaders demanded transparency. Parliamentary hearings were announced, then quietly postponed. Senior officials faced an impossible dilemma: admit the imbalance and risk investor retaliation, or maintain silence and absorb public anger. Either choice carried consequences. Investors sensed the tension. Hedge funds began positioning around volatility, not in the mining company itself, but in currencies and bonds tied to the region. When whispers of contract renegotiation surfaced, bond yields twitched. Not sharply. Just enough to signal unease. On the ground, workers noticed subtle changes. Procurement shifted overseas. Local suppliers were phased out. Profits were increasingly booked elsewhere, even as extraction accelerated. To ordinary families, it felt like watching wealth pass through their country without stopping. Journalists finally named the pattern. This wasn't corruption in the traditional sense. It was structural. A deal engineered to survive governments, elections, and public opinion. Legal, durable, and devastatingly efficient. By the time markets fully grasped the implications, the leverage was already locked in. The global reaction reached its peak when commodity prices surged unexpectedly. A supply shock elsewhere sent demand racing toward the minerals controlled by the deal. Overnight, the agreement's true value was revealed, not in revenue but in power. Buyers had no alternatives. Governments had no flexibility. Prices moved but control didn't. Foreign markets responded with a strange calm. The company's stock barely flinched. Its stability was now its strength. Analysts praised its resilience to political noise, even as that noise grew louder. What unsettled economists wasn't volatility, it was how insulated the arrangement had become. Inside international institutions, the tone shifted. Policy papers warned about resource asymmetry and sovereign dilution. Quietly, case studies were drafted. The deal became an example, never officially condemned but frequently cited. A lesson wrapped in neutral language. For the country involved, the consequences crystallized. Attempts to renegotiate triggered legal threats. Credit ratings faced review. Development plans stalled as fiscal projections were revised downward. Every option carried a cost, and all of them were paid locally. Ordinary citizens watched the debate unfold from a distance. The mine operated at full capacity. Headlines spoke of billions. Daily life remained unchanged. The gap between extraction and experience had never felt wider. In the end, the world didn't react with outrage. It reacted with acceptance. Markets adapted. Governments adjusted. Investors moved on. And that quiet acceptance revealed the most unsettling truth of all. This deal wasn't an anomaly. It was a template. With the tension no longer rising, a different phase began: reflection. Not the kind found in official statements or earnings calls, but the quieter kind that settles in once outcomes become unavoidable. Economists revisited the numbers with fresh eyes. What they saw wasn't just lost revenue, but lost optionality. The country had surrendered its ability to respond to future shocks. In academic circles, the deal became shorthand for a deeper shift in global finance. Ownership was no longer about flags or borders. It was about contracts that outlived governments and clauses that neutralized sovereignty without force. The mine hadn't been taken. It had been enclosed, legally, permanently. For policymakers, the realization arrived too late. Development strategies built on resource wealth now rested on assumptions that no longer held. Infrastructure plans were scaled back. Social programs faced delays. The mine produced endlessly, yet public budgets remained constrained, as if the wealth existed in a parallel economy. Ordinary citizens framed it differently. In interviews, people spoke of expectation rather than economics. They remembered what was promised. Roads that would connect towns. Schools that would train a new generation. Instead, they watched trucks roll past, carrying value outward, destination unknown. Journalists stopped asking who signed the deal and started asking why it was even possible. The answer, uncomfortable as it was, pointed beyond any single government. It lived in global competition, fiscal desperation, and a financial system that rewards speed over scrutiny. The mine was still there. The minerals still flowed. But ownership, real ownership, had slipped into abstraction. In the years that followed, other countries began to hesitate. Contracts were reviewed more carefully. Negotiations slowed. Some deals were rejected outright, not because they were illegal but because their long-term costs were finally understood. The influence of that single agreement echoed quietly, shaping decisions far beyond its borders. Investors adapted as well. Risk models evolved. Political stability was no longer enough. Contractual rigidity became the real asset. Capital flowed toward structures that minimized democratic interference, a trend rarely discussed openly, but deeply felt across emerging markets. For the global financial system, the lesson was subtle and unsettling. Wealth no longer needed coercion to concentrate. It only needed patience, legal precision, and timing. Power could be acquired without spectacle, and held without resistance. The country at the center of the story continued forward. Life went on. Elections were held. Budgets passed. The mine remained productive, a constant reminder of a moment when urgency outweighed foresight. For younger generations, it became history. For economists, a case study. For citizens, a quiet inheritance they never agreed to accept. In the end, the deal didn't just reshape wealth. It redefined what control looks like in modern finance. Not loud. Not violent. Just permanent. And once you see it, it's impossible to unsee. In the end, stories like this don't belong to one country or one contract. They belong to a system that quietly rewards those who understand time, leverage, and legal permanence better than anyone else. Global finance doesn't always announce its winners and losers. Sometimes it simply locks them in. For viewers, the lesson lingers uncomfortably. The most powerful financial decisions are rarely made in moments of crisis, but in moments of calm, when urgency dulls scrutiny and the future feels abstract. By the time consequences surface, the architecture is already set. The global economy may seem distant, technical, and impersonal. Yet its mechanics shape lives in ways that feel deeply personal years later. And somewhere, right now, another agreement is being signed, quietly deciding who will own tomorrow's wealth long before the world realizes it.